This call is being recorded.
Now we're being recorded. And thank you, Ariadna and Sarah and Andrea, to join us in this meeting and organize this session. So I want to give everyone a warm welcome. Thanks for joining us. And the idea and intention of this session is mainly to have a conversation around copyright and open access in museums in the age of COVID-19. A lot of museums and galleries and libraries and archives are going online due to the task force, a lot of questions around copyright and open access. So we wanted to have the opinion of our speakers today around these issues and how museums and institutions are sort of facing these issues. So we had prepared a couple of questions in case we didn't have like anyone joining, which is not the case, likely. But in case you want to ask some questions, there's a sound that you can use to ask whatever question you might have and might arise as the speakers showing us. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce she's the Junior Policy Advisor on Copyright Issues Engagement at Europeana. We have Sarah Pearson, who is the General Counsel for Creative Commons, and it's also a lawyer and knows a lot about CC licenses and copyright. And we have Andrea Wallace, who is a lecturer at law at the University of Exeter, and is also involved in all sort of Open GLAM issues. So hi there. Can you unmute yourselves, please?
Hi. Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Great. Cool. So we have seen that a lot of museums are now in the midst of mad scrambles, sort of, to quickly implement new ways to bring their museums to an audience at home. However, we know that copyright is still a big issue there. So what are your opinions? What are the tools that can help museums evaluate the risks of their audience engagement strategies, broadly speaking? And what are the most important copyright issues that they have to keep in mind?
Who wants to start?
Go ahead.
Okay, it's quite a broad question, and I don't intend to have the solution for everything. And from Europeana, we're also starting to think about this because if I can just do a very brief intro, we're not there just to be a digital library, which is already it's already fantastic, but we're also there to support the profession. So we want to be an initiative that gathers people with similar struggles in this occasion and see what we can do together to be there for them. And so we're right now gathering insights, and this call is particularly interesting for me to understand what other people in the sector might be facing. So, well, with that said, we're talking about the context of digital Open GLAM, right? So, like we're saying, collections going online. In terms of managing the risk, it's a bit difficult to say. There's obviously the copyright questions that arise when an institution goes digital, which are a lot. And I think this situation is teaching us something quite important that I think the Open GLAM movement has been saying for a long time, which is that we need to look at copyright from the get-go. So whenever an artwork comes into the institution through a license, through a purchase, by being made by the institution in itself, we really need to consider all the copyright challenges that are in there, clarify the situation so that then if situations like the current one that we're facing arise, going digital is much more easy. I think I've seen that many institutions that maybe do not integrate this process into their way of working. Maybe the biggest ones that they've got this and it's okay, but maybe the smaller ones that we're hearing less from are struggling right now because clearing copyright has not been a part of the whole process inside the institution. So I think that's just a small lesson, but a good one that we need to think about in the future. I can talk about specific copyright issues if you want, but maybe let's do a round and see what others think.
I can add a little bit. This is a really broad question, so I was trying to think of how I would begin to tackle it. And I guess for me, it's always helpful to kind of divide issues or divide things up into buckets or categories. And so, copyright issues are relatively simple when you're talking about stuff that the museum owns or that's in the public domain. So you can kind of cordon off that as one easier category. And then there's another category is, stuff that copyrighted works that you don't own. And so there you're going to either need permission to do what you're going to do, whether it's under a CC license or, some sort of express agreement with the copyright holder, or rely on an exception or limitation. And in that context, so I know the most about fair use because I'm a US lawyer. And so that's the exception and limitation I'm most familiar with. And there, we may end up talking in more depth about fair use, but the most essential factor there is thinking about the purpose and character of what it is that you're doing. And in these circumstances with this public health emergency where people, where physical access to the works is not an option, obviously your fair use argument is a lot stronger in this time. But I think that doesn't mean that it's just, foolproof by any means. I think that the things that I would think about from a fair use perspective when using copyrighted material in this context are really thinking about why you're using the work. So there's, again, this is so broad because this could mean anything, but say you're creating something that is a slideshow of works and you're adding music to it, for example, you're going to want to be really careful about, what music you're using and thinking about why that specific work is necessary. And also then thinking about the amount of the work that you're using. Those are also going to be, really important factors there. And then the third bucket, I guess, is copyright and stuff that you're creating right now and that you will be creating in these next few weeks or months or however long this goes on. And in some ways, that is very similar to the first category because in most instances you will probably own the copyright, but I think there are some special considerations to think about there. Thinking about things like when you do a virtual tour of the facility, if that's still possible, or doing anything inside an institution where you might be capturing copyrighted works in what you're doing, you're going to want to think about how much of that work you're capturing and whether it's if it's just purely incidental, that's not going to be problematic. But if you're really focusing on a particular work, then you're going to want to think about copyright and whether or not you're adding some commentary or doing, having some purpose to how long you're looking at that particular work. So I think that there are definitely still things to think about when you're talking about copyright in works that you're creating right now. But I'll kind of stop there and then kind of see where the conversation goes. We can dig in more depth.
Great. I'll add my 2 cents. So first of all, I mean, this is just weird and bizarre. And I know we all keep saying, oh, this is so unprecedented and no one really has any plans. But I mean, that really is kind of the truth of it. And I know we've been talking about this a lot in academia because we're all trying to readjust to how to work from home and how to engage, with audiences from home, but not thinking about this as an opportunity for, productivity and kind of placing expectations we might not actually be able to realize. Thinking about this in terms of reevaluating in light of the current scenario, how we're actually, and especially the need for connecting with people in new ways, in ways that we previously, relied on physical access and physical social situations, to just kind of readjust some of that networking and thinking about what the future of engagement is going to be going forward. So I also thought it would be great to give maybe a shout out to everyone who's on a digital team who's probably getting, dozens of emails about a great new idea or this other sort of thing, or I think a lot of us who are more technology literate are kind of becoming a source of support for our institutions at the moment, however that may be. And if you're involved with the digital side of your institution, that's obviously a greater burden. So I think, thinking about some of those ideas and encouraging people to have them is really helpful. But in terms of mental health and thinking about how we're going to navigate everything else that's going on, it's good to put into perspective. So, with that in mind, thinking about how we kind of lower our standards and work with what we do have, things that we do have control over, and the different types of engagement that we can do because we're able to start thinking about some of these things a little bit differently. And I think part of that, and one of the biggest questions, is going to be about considering copyright in the content creation that institutions are engaging with at the moment. Because a lot of it will be really great, interesting types of engagement from the inside of someone's home. We might start to think about privacy and issues around that differently. That's not necessarily related to copyright, but the images or the video or the output itself could attract copyright. So even though copyright will automatically attach, when we're thinking about the purposes of copyright, the incentives for it, and the fact that an institution may not necessarily see that as the type of asset that it could eventually commercialize, we can start to build that into how we're managing the content that we're creating at the moment. So having discussions around, okay, so if we're doing these types of videos, might we choose some Creative Commons licenses to make that stuff available? Do we do a CC BY or a CC BY SA or a CC BY NC? What would be the different types of uses that then could be put to as we continue to, remain at home and look for new ways to kind of connect with each other, especially thinking about how content can be used in situations that would then apply an exception to the copyright of the institution that they may be claiming in some of that content. So, educational videos or videos that are made, for kids to follow along and make art at home. If that then gets used, for a teaching purpose, an exception will already apply to that in the first place. So might we think about how to license things a bit more openly, because we have actually no intention to commercialize it in the way that we normally think about IP that's generated during this time. At the same time, there may be IP that results that absolutely brings commercial value back to the institution. So trying to think about what those different types of things are in those outputs, and ask those questions, because I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting data that's produced over the next period of isolation, or however this gets approached, in terms of what new parameters around copyright and suitability then get applied to reuse in a digital environment, especially with content creation, but thinking about future proofing and thinking about how these are going to be media that then circulate and potentially get collected later down the road, or archived as part of the response to what happens, whether that's by the institution and by other institutions. And thinking about what we do have control over, which would specifically be the type of content that maybe doesn't raise copyright questions, or the content that we are creating that we would have intellectual property in and can license appropriately for greater reuse. Especially thinking that some of the stuff we may be using, certain exceptions and limitations are all going to be jurisdictional. So they'll apply within, the United States if we're in the United States, or the United Kingdom within the United Kingdom, But right now, everyone is turning to online and trying to network and trying to connect and circulate, new things that people are doing. So I think that it will be an interesting space to watch in terms of how we start to adjust our expectations around copyright globally, and if this forces some sort of, legal reform or new thinking around what those cross-border issues mean. But yeah, more of these, I guess this is just more bigger questions rather than any sort of specific things that we can be thinking about internally, but just flagging some interesting areas that we might consider through the discussion today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just the one that you just mentioned, Andrea, because I feel that there are a lot of initiatives that are going right now. Like I'm pretty sure some of the people that is in this call has already seen the public fair use statement that a group of librarians did in the US, and now the Internet Archive has also launched the National Emergency Library just to give access to students that are homeschooling now due to the crisis. So I was wondering what's sort of your perspective on these issues. So should museums be doing something similar? Should be sort of saying, hey, like we already acknowledge that copyright law has a lot of limitations in terms of what we can offer, and maybe be at the front of challenging some of those issues? Or should we take a more conservative approach and be like, no, we should keep on abiding by copyright laws and make sure that everything is clear before we do anything?
Can I start? Yes, I've definitely seen these statements and the initiatives of many organizations, which are really interesting. So, and when I was trying to compare this statement to the context in which I work, which is Europe and a digital library, and I think this statement is great because it's a lot of librarians coming together to support people they work for or work with, which are their peers in the university sector, for instance. And so they want to support them in their activities that they do now from home to be able to continue performing online teaching. And now I'm thinking, like, who would be the equivalents in a digital library like Europeana, like who is the sector that we're working for and that we're trying to support in this, like always, and particularly now at this time. And so I'm thinking we've got colleagues in the office that work with the education and research sector. And it's always very interesting and complicated at the same time to communicate what people can do with our collections. In this sense, we rely very strongly on Creative Commons licenses and tools and on the right statements. But there's always, it's always quite complicated to make sure the user is really understanding what they can do. We've got, for instance, exceptions and limitations in Europe that may allow a user to do more than what the right statement or the license indicates. And how do we communicate this to educators that might think from a license that they cannot use it for online teaching where they can actually do that? So I think I'd be very curious to know how institutions are approaching this now that maybe everything is moving digitally. So a librarian who would often be there to support the person at the university and guide them on how to build course packs and what materials to use or not to use now needs to rely maybe on more standardized information on a website. And I'm particularly interested to know how people inform educators, researchers, and others about the possibilities to rely on exceptions and limitations. Because in Europe, we have some, they're not perfect, but we should not forget about them. And also, I'm very interested to talk about standardized rights, so right statements and Creative Commons licenses, and seeing the role that they can play right now in this time. Actually, I forgot what the question was. I'm not sure I answered it.
No worries. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was going to I think the question was around whether to kind of abandon copyright to some extent right now, or to remain conservative.
Or to push the limits on copyright a little bit. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess my initial thought is to kind of be somewhere in between. That I think this is a really good opportunity to push the line a bit in terms of. Oops, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay. Especially around exceptions and limitations. And I know that lots of times people are, particularly practitioners, are very hesitant to rely on fair use, for example, in the United States. And so I think this is a time where we can have a lot more comfort than even any other time, probably, to kind of rely on fair use and other exceptions and limitations. And I think that could have ripple effects when this is over, that we will kind of then see that the world didn't end, it didn't kill copyright. In fact, maybe it even made the whole system work exactly as it should. In terms of, maybe this is, I guess, a second part of the question and that we're not quite at yet, but thinking about what this means for open access generally down the road. I mean, to me, it's hard to imagine that it doesn't kind of help. Even, I think for one thing, people are going to realize that in this moment, I guess two things. One, that whatever we do online doesn't ever replace being face-to-face and seeing something in person and having a real human experience. And we're never, we're going to feel that very viscerally right now, and we can't have that. And so that kind of helps assuage the concerns that people often have is, what if digital ends up, what if I destroy the market for my physical space? I think that is, we're going to have a lot of reassurance about that. I think we're also already seeing how these digital tools can be, really meaningful ways to connect with one another and to create connections with creative works as well. And so I think it's hard for me to see how those things won't have ripple effects when this is over on people's willingness to share more broadly, and whether it's CC licensing or not. But
yeah, I think I don't think copyright is, going to go out the window. And I think we're all also, in terms of what we're doing in our positions and our jobs, very aware of how important it is to protect the valid, the rights of the rights holder. And I don't think any of the things that people are thinking about right now, obviously making some assumptions about that, are probably the types of things that goes beyond that. So at the moment, we're still probably approaching this from a pretty kind of risk-adverse perspective, and also a sensitive perspective around the rights holders. And so, no one's necessarily advocating for throwing out, the baby with the bathwater, but we're thinking about that risk in the future of who feels comfortable to push some of those kind of gray areas around what the exceptions and limitations allow us to do. And I think I agree with Sarah that there will be some really interesting growth around some of these exceptions because they will be tested. And I don't think that will be the type of thing that crumbles a copyright system. If anything, it can make it more fair and equitable for both users and rights holders. But there will have to be that approach and that kind of, I guess, awareness of risk in doing some of those things and being comfortable with what that brings. So I would actually encourage people to embrace the risk around some of those gray areas because they're probably not as risky as you potentially think that they could be. I think there's also a difference between obviously the in copyright content, the public domain content, and thinking about the content that's already created that we do have that has IP parameters around it already. So from the museums from home, it's the hashtag museums from home kind of movement that's starting. They're collecting instances of institutions opening up some of their catalogs and making things available online, thinking about their own resources and how that then can be provided for greater engagement. But I think there's also a big question here that obviously has to do with the spread of the virus itself, and who's being affected, is who will have access to this, and what we're thinking about in terms of digital and staying in touch and social, I guess, social impact. Because, and I know this, we're having to completely revise how we're approaching assessments, and we're thinking about how we can engage with students, because there are a lot of students who now have gone from Exeter home to places where they don't have a great web connection, or they're currently sharing a place with multiple people who are all using the Wi-Fi. So thinking about how to build in different forms of engagement, even lower quality, so that they do reach other people in other places, not necessarily the ones that are local to you, could be really useful, and could be a way to think about making the access and the digital discussion a bit more equitable in terms of what we can be doing. Because, in reality, all of this networking is actually going to push people who do have digital connections and digital access forward. And we're going to, potentially lose a lot of interesting engagement from people who aren't able to access what's going on digitally.
Can I actually ask two people in the call if there's is there any particular worries that you're currently dealing with, or projects you're thinking of that, from a copyright perspective, can be very challenging? Because I'm really interested to understand what you're facing, to better understand what you're facing right now. And I see a lot of comments, so you probably have some thoughts.
Yes, we can open the mic for questions. It's not a problem. Just unmute yourself and jump in. Or maybe someone wants to share a little bit of the experiences that they are doing right now. Some of them are sharing them on the side chat. Someone is saying, I'm finding it. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's the one I wanted to underline.
Oh, okay. So Liam is asking, for example, I'd like to know if any GLAM has made a specific copyright policy change because of the pandemic. I don't know if we can answer that, but maybe there's someone in this call that can, because we have a lot of people here. Has any of you made any changes? Yeah.
Hey, this is Ann Young at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields. We haven't made any changes yet, but I definitely brought home my documentation on our IP and open access policy, which is due for review this year, and figured that would be a good work from home project to look at, which one of the things that we're going to be working on with that review is actually formalizing our fair use procedures and documentation. So I don't know how much of that is necessarily in response to what is going on right now, but I've definitely moved it up, because right now our plan was just to get that IP policy and adding in our fair use procedures and documenting all of that done by the end of the calendar year. And instead, we're probably going to try to fast track that and get that done in the next month or two.
I guess that also sort of lead us, right, that around open access in a way, because we know that a lot of people are now asking themselves the questions, should we go open? And as Andrea said, probably this is not the time in which you want to consider that question right now, because it's sort of the craziness. But in a way, what are sort of the future or the next steps that might follow after the crisis settles down, and how we can actually make more institutional change in this direction? Or what are the sort of questions that maybe we can start having as conversations with managers and decision makers at museums, so as to move forward the next steps?
And sorry, because I was reading Liam's comment on your article, and that the copyright part is it's maybe a bit empty for now, but yeah. I'm thinking that maybe it's not the time to be opportunistic about these things, but what other people were saying just now is that those who have embraced open access, so it's maybe those are the ones who will maybe not need to review their policies right now, so they can still be present online and engage with their audiences much more easily than institutions that haven't been able to do this digital transformation for any reason. It can be because of a lack of capacity, not of a lack of support for open policies. But so, because maybe there's no big change that policies will require, but we can learn a lot from the Open GLAM movement and those who have embraced open access, because these policies were already fit for purpose for a period like this one. Well, I'm not sure that helps, but it's just a thought.
I guess one thought that I have is I feel like it's really important for open access advocates to avoid any kind of "you're doing it wrong" framing right now. And pointing at, well, that's not really open access, or it's definitely not the time for those kinds of conversations, in my opinion. But what I think we can do that would be really fruitful is trying, experimenting in different ways, and then if it's possible, trying to keep track of metrics, or at least, it doesn't have to be anything formal, but just trying to do a lot of documentation so that when the time comes and the dust settles, we can point to, look what happened when we shared such and such freely, and we had, this great engagement from X number of people, and trying to get, some case studies under our belts during this time seems like a really nice way to approach it. But I guess I would just tend to really, I think we should be very thoughtful about not kind of pointing fingers, and also, frankly, trying to get people to rush to really formally open in a CC licensing way their collections right now, because these, as probably everybody on this call knows, but the licenses are irrevocable. There are lots of complicated rights issues involved lots of times, and so it's not something that you don't want to just slap a CC license on something without really thinking about it, particularly for these important collections. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be interesting to see what those metrics are and how they relate to open content, and if we can even garner anything from that. Because I know there's been some bigger kind of open access announcements in the past, or Heidi was saying that they recently made a change for 3D models to a CC0 license. So there could be like a natural jump in reuse, but then because of everyone turning to digital and not being able to be as mobile, that might actually skyrocket. So I think it would be interesting to document those changes or collect metrics and that sort of thing, because later it could be really important to making some of the arguments either internally or for other institutions to make those arguments if they have access to those types of data and case studies. But yeah, I think I think also there could be some interesting baby steps that can occur during this time. So whether previously everything was set up to be CC by NC, that then because the rights assessment has been done and the institution made the decision to do CC by NC, they then take the next step to go CC by SA or CC by. So we could see some incremental changes because some of the work has already been prepared. But I think this is something that Scan and I were talking about. There is a lot of work that goes into preparing collections for open access, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And it also shouldn't be seen as an opportunity at the moment, because I think that's a standard that's too high for anyone to think about in terms of how they're going to go, you know what, let's take our collection and make it available in open access online. We've got time and we've got digital content. Probably incremental steps and baby steps or as far as you should be kind of aiming at the moment. Everything seems really risky to begin with in the first place. But I think sharing that information and that conversation and networking and staying connected with people who are also going through those things will be probably the most helpful thing to do at this time.
I have a question that I'd like to float by you clever heads. One of the ideas that came out of this shutdown is a good colleague in Sweden who sees connections between Hammershøi, Edward Hopper, and David Hockney, the empty spaces that he feels resonates with the current situation where everybody's alone together. And he said, could we do a digital virtual exhibition of these three painters? Do some kind of curational trick to bring them together in an online space. I was thinking that IIIF might be a way to bring these artworks together in, using this framework where images can be compared and added to the same virtual space. But I was also not certain about rights for an idea like this, because Hammershøi is out of copyright due to age, but Hopper and Hockney are still in copyright. Hopper is dead, Hockney is alive. Any ideas on how to approach this and how what kind of solution would be good for this? I mean, the artworks would be coming from different institutions. Is it possible at all? I just think I love the idea. But
I mean, I agree. I think that's exactly the type of connections that are ideal for this type of situation. And that potentially might be one of those gray areas that you and your collaborators would feel comfortable pushing. It would totally, of course, I hate to be like the awful copyright lawyer who says it depends, but it does. It depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on the exceptions that are in place within that jurisdiction, where the institutions are located, what the licensing agreements might be between the institution and the artist if the work is in copyright, which is why you might decide to go with all public domain content to be safe. But then, of course, we start to think about how that's skewing everyone's perception about what art is valuable and what stories are important to tell, because we keep going back, 70 years prior to everything that's conclusively in the public domain, so we feel comfortable using it. And we start to then miss out on a lot of like great contemporary enrichment, especially potentially more relevant for things that are going on at the moment. So I don't know, Rita, I think that sounds amazing. I think everything you do is amazing. And so I would say, just please keep doing everything and asking
Andrea.
those questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't have an answer. It was just a comment it made me think of something. But go ahead, Marita.
No, I was just going to say that I'm going to try and look into which collections have these artists, and maybe some of them are using the IIIF technology, allowing, if not to reuse any images, but just to view. I mean, if we could only allow a virtual exhibition where you can view these artworks together, that's all I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Oh, sorry, someone wanted.
One possibility that comes to mind is the Google Cultural Institute, and I offer that up knowing full well all the problems around trying to work with Google. But if there was anybody on the planet who was likely to already have Hockney, Hopper, and Hammerskill in some way, shape, or form, it's probably them. And it's a walled garden, but it's a pretty big walled garden, and it has the internal capacity for members to be able to pull artworks from other institutions, as long as the host institution has basically toggled that box on. So it could conceivably operate within GCI right now, given the way GCI is currently set up, as long as the assets were already there. And I would be surprised if Hopper wasn't there, and I'd be less surprised, but still surprised if Hockney wasn't there in some way, shape, or form. And, they have gone out of their way to push the whole, like, you can't download anything from the Google Cultural Institute unless you know how to make a screen grab. But whatever. They have at least taken steps enough to lower the risk threshold a bit. So worth exploring.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, actually. How should one approach them? Because, I mean, the SMK is part of Google Cultural Institute. We've done several exhibitions there. We have part of our collection there, but I don't have a current contact there. It's been a while since we've done anything with them.
And
do you know what a good approach could be? Excuse me, I couldn't hear that.
I think I might have a general contact for the Google Cultural Institute somewhere. I know my media recently left them, but I feel like I was given a general set of contact information. I will dig through my emails and try to send that over to you, Murat.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I can do the same. All of my emails are a couple of years out of date, but there is some generic contact info in there.
I'll shoot my email here.
Something that I was just thinking is for fair use and fair dealing countries, it's going to be a lot of assessing where the gray areas are and assessing whether you want to jump and test them. And I'm thinking that for a lot of countries with more specific exceptions and limitations, it's also a good opportunity to test how far they go and whether they allow us to bring forward all the projects that would be interested to develop in the digital world. Because the areas might be more black and white rather than gray, or there's still some gray spaces, but it's but I think we're going to have a lot more walls that we're going to be facing because they're a bit more strict in the way they're written. But I think it would be really interesting to keep writing them down. And now that there's especially a lot of copyright reforms going on in Europe, it's also a good moment to eventually. So it's a good test for our laws and see whether they're fit for the digital age and to the way that we're like driving towards. And I don't know if anyone read Tim's comment, which is now you have to scroll up a bit, but But I also think it's very interesting what the more like scientific publishing sector is doing, and how some people that were lobbying for opposite interests, now they're coming together to maybe find a flexible solution that is for the benefit of all. So it's also very interesting to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and if no one else has another question, I mean, like, please feel free to jump in whenever you want. We don't have a lot of time left. Our idea was to finish this call at in an hour sharp, so we're sort of reaching the end of the hour. But I guess that one last question, so that was already sort of answer a bit, but maybe like you can expand a little bit more on this. It's like how we can make sure that institutions are now having some tools to collect all the things that are happening now to archive for the future, which I think it's one of the biggest concerns too. There are a lot of like things going on now, a lot of media being shared, a lot of information being shared, and most of it is actually not under a CC license or under any permissible license. And is there any general consideration that we want to sort of like point people to in order to make sure that the information that is being generated now doesn't create a further problem?
Do you mean shared by institutions or shared publicly by anybody?
Shared publicly by anybody, but also by institutions.
Well, I think I know that the National Library of Scotland did some really interesting archiving of social media and other content before, during, and after the Scottish referendum. So I think, looking to what other institutions are doing around this, maybe there's some case studies out there. I know that there's been collections around some of the women's marches, signs that were left behind, that sort of thing. So I'm sure that there's probably great resources out there about how to start looking at managing even basic to much more complex content. But in a way, some of that might not be as, like, for collection purposes and archive purposes, might not be as risky as we think, because when we're thinking about social media, the terms and conditions and the really broad contracts that will apply to the content that we submit, should, and especially other exceptions that could depend on the jurisdiction, institutions won't have a problem collecting some of this. I think also something that's interesting to think about is potentially user-generated content. And as institutions start working more directly with users or inviting digital participation, thinking about what that will look like going forward, and how to design equitable practices around asking for a license instead of asking a user to assign certain rights or waive them in any content that they generate, like a non-exclusive license to the institution. There are a lot of dark areas on I mean cultural institutions, websites. When you look at how they kind of manage user-generated content, it's almost like, I think the lawyers fully take over at that point, and you see the way that the language is constructed, all perpetuity, any digital media now and forever known, you waive moral rights, the right to be associated with it. Fight back against your lawyers during this phase, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And try to maybe potentially work with them for designing more equitable practices around some of this. I guess that's my 2 cents, would be more about kind of the user-generated content and public engagement aspect of rights management and future-proofing, and thinking about appropriate practices.
Yeah, a dirty secret about being a lawyer, I can say as a lawyer, is that it's the safest way to practice law is to be as conservative as possible. And so that's particularly when people are just, being reactionary, the safest thing is to be conservative. And so I agree. I echo the pushback, and I always appreciate it when I get it from my colleagues as well. And then I guess just to build on what Andrea said, a relatively simple solution for that is having people apply a CC license when they're uploading user-generated content to a platform, and that's a relatively common solution for that problem. But yes, fight back against your lawyers. I love it. That's the theme of the webinar.
Great. I don't know if you want to make any last thoughts or last questions.
I'd just like to thank you for the initiative. I think it's brilliant that you offer this also just to get together and have a chance to ping pong concerns and ideas and get some valid information on how to go about these things. It's really very, very thoughtful of you.
I would also like to hear what other people do in the meantime. So I don't know if, obviously no one's talked about this, but if there's a potential for something like this to happen again in a month or so, I think it would be really interesting to even flip it, to hear what people have been doing, because that I think would be the most interesting. Like, we're at the outset right now. We're just thinking kind of proactively and trying to anticipate the various things that may arise. But I'm sure that all of this will be completely different a month from now, and we'll have a lot more insight and examples of what people are doing on the ground. So I would love to hear how what's happening in practice.
I want to give that one a +1, because right now everything that I'm doing is just a bunch of Google Docs and video conferences talking about what we should be doing starting next week. So a month or a month and a half would be a great time to see things starting to become real. Yeah,
that sounds like a great idea. I don't know. So since this was sort of organized between Open GLAM and MCN, like there are a lot of different channels that you can join. But basically, you can either subscribe to the MCN. I think Margaret has shared the link there to the Basecamp, to the copyright community. You can also join the Creative Commons Slack channel, which is creativecommons.slack.com, where most of the people that has participated in the call is. Also, there's the Europeana copyright community that I think Killian, if I don't remember incorrectly, shared the link to. And of course, we're going to be uploading this to some YouTube channel. I guess it's gonna be the MCN YouTube channel. Basically, yes, we'll keep in touch with everyone, and we'll announce on different social media channels if we end up doing a similar event like this. And of course, I want to also give a shout out to Anne too, that participated in this call. For those of you who are thinking around going open access, you should definitely check her series on the Open GLAM medium that we have on how to go Open GLAM, because that's like a great conversation starter and food for thought in these times of crisis. And I want to finish this, of course, by thanking Ariadna and Sarah and Andrea for joining us today. Thank you very much. It has been very, very exceptional content and material, and a lot of food for thought, as someone said in the side comments. And thanks everyone too for joining today.
Thank you, Scan, for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks, Scan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Thank you. This was great.